So, first, I just want to share my thoughts in general on Norman Finkelstein as a person and how he's perceived in the world. When I always knew him to be a controversial figure. I mean, I've seen some of his lectures in the past. I've understood his rhetoric to be inflammatory, but only after advertising that we're going to have him on the show did I realize how visceral of a reaction many Jews and many Israelis have to Norman Finkelstein. It's not just viewing him as anti-Israel. It's not just acknowledging that he's inflammatory. It seems like I know hate is a tough word, but it seems like many Jews hate, or at the very least despise, Norman Finkelstein. And I really, try to understand where this hate or anger, at least, is coming from. And through listening to my Jewish friends who, shared with me why they despise Norm, and through researching him more, I finally understood. I get why he's despised in the Jewish community. Norman has done many things in his career. Put his criticism of Israel aside, it's not rare to see him engage in an anti-Semitic trope. He does this I've seen him do this on a few occasions. Also, he's constantly comparing Israel to Nazis. Many consider this to be anti-Semitic. This was what our conversation was about. I decided not to frame it as anti-Semitic because I knew he would be open to hearing that narrative. And this is really another point that I think upsets many Jews about Norman Finkelstein, is that he's very dismissive about anti-Semitism. Like whenever Jews bring up their concern with anti-Semitism, he's dismissive. He delegitimizes any concern someone might have. And even more so, if Norman were to say all the same things he said throughout his career, but he wasn't Jewish, then most people would agree that he's anti-Semitic. It's only because he's Jewish has he gotten really a free pass on a lot of things he said. I recognize this. And if somebody thinks I'm making outlandish claims, you just need to research things he said enough, and you can see that there's a long track list of anti-Semitic remarks, or just delegitimizing concerns of anti-Semitism, or things like Holocaust inversion. And this, people were upset that I'm platforming somebody who very well may use this platform to spread hate, for example. They also view Norman as somebody who has very much normalized anti-Semitism because he's a Jew who is doing it, so he'll go to like far left circles or just left-wing circles and say certain things that most Jews would agree are anti-Semitic, but he, for example, would not. I could just give one example. So recently somebody asked me about the increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes during our recent conflict with Gaza. And he says, that's not anti-Semitic. That's a result of what Israel's doing. So that, to me, I imagine that he would not feel the same way had we framed it differently. Let's say racist attacks were to increase the summer of 2020 because of all the protests and riots, right? If somebody were to say, well, this increase in racism isn't really racism, it's just people responding to rioting. Or, for example, if someone were to try to justify the increase in anti-Asian hate, for example, say, oh, this isn't anti-Asian hate, people are just upset that what China's doing to the Uyghurs, for example, right? This logic doesn't hold true, especially not for people who identify as left. But Norman has no problem dismissing that anti-Semitism because he somehow attributes it to Israel's actions. Regardless of if Israel's actions in one way or another fuels anti-Semitism, the dismissal itself seems to be inconsistent with how we would view group hate. It doesn't matter what Israel does. Attacking somebody for some characteristic is not justifiable, and he tries to justify it. So I understand why he's so strongly despised in the Jewish community. I personally don't have those feelings towards him. And I think, first of all, we just need to recognize that everybody's different. Um, you know, naturally, I don't get super triggered when I hear people say hateful things towards Jews or towards Israelis. It's not that I don't see anything wrong with it, but it just gets me less upset. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't be upset. We need to acknowledge that everybody's different in how they respond to certain things. Now, I view Norman as very much somebody who, in all likelihood, carries deep childhood trauma. I think, even in our conversation, he very much expressed how a lot of who he is his childhood and values his mother instilled in him. And even though the Holocaust inversion, he ultimately acknowledged that his mother made him that way. Um, I have sympathy for him. I have sympathy for him, but also I have a level of respect for him as well. Again, I view him as deeply traumatized, but I also see him as somebody who has dedicated his life to a cause he believes in. It goes without saying that we have very different approaches to how we engage in dialogue and how we try to convince people, and this was really what the majority of our conversation was about. But I'm choosing to see past his inflammatory remarks, his hateful remarks, and I'm also willing to forgive what he's done in essentially fueling anti-Semitism in left-wing circles, because I do think that is a very legitimate claim that Jews have made against him. I kind of see him as like a grandfather figure who had a difficult life, who has a funny sense of humor, and who I thoroughly enjoy speaking to, right? Now, when we're angry at people, or when we hate people, we should ask ourselves what the purpose of this anger is. So let's say somebody's anti-Semitic, does something anti-Semitic, and a lot of people get angry and they call that person out. That might incentivize that person to not engage in anti-Semitism any longer. So here we see how anger fuels action, and action can achieve results, right? That being said, I think at this stage in life, first of all, I don't think Norman is fazed at all by the anger towards him. If anything, I think it might fuel him. But I think it's fair to say that the anger that Jews have towards Norman, and this is true about anger in general, but the anger that many Jews are harboring within them towards one individual who himself is a Jew, is harming them more than it harms him, right? That's something we should always keep in mind with anger. It's hurting you more than the person you're angry at. It's something you're holding within you. That's why we should work to let anger pass fairly quickly. If it helps motivate or drive us, then we should use that. But we should not dwell on that anger too long, because it eats us inside from within. So I'm choosing not to be angry at Norm. I enjoyed my conversation with him. I enjoyed speaking to him on the phone prior, and I plan to continue correspondence with him moving forward.